I feel thin, sort of stretched, like butter scraped over too much bread. J.R.R. Tolkien.
You're listening to Writing Roots, brought to you by Aspen House Publishing.
Welcome to Writing Roots. I'm Lee Hull.
And I'm Lee Esses.
Too much bread or too little butter makes for a very not tasty story.
Yeah. So the topic we are covering today is word count. A lot of people ask, how do I fluff up my story to hit the target word count? How do I bring it down because I have way too many? These are questions that a lot of authors have regarding word count. I will say, if you aren't in the editing process of your book, but you've come to this episode to worry about your word count, we have a lot of other great episodes. Check out any one of those. This is for people who are editing their books only.
I technically had a target word goal for my book at 75,000 words, which is on the upper end of the standard word count for the genre. I came 10,000 words short of that. But I also know I have entire scenes that I need to add because I came to a point later where I was like, oh, hey, this needs to happen. So I went back and made a note saying, this needs to happen.
Let's say you finished writing the book and you're listening to this episode going, my word count is still off in some regard. Something else to keep in mind is sometimes your story is just going to be that length.
If you're writing a fantasy book and your book is only 50,000 words, that is okay. You don't need to try to hit the standard 90,000 words because we don't need 40,000 words of uselessness.
Yeah. The last thing you want to do is add more butter or more bread to your toast and make it less palatable.
You need just the right amount of both.
Keep in mind the definition of a story. A story is a problem and its solution. Knowing where the problem starts and where the solution ends it will help you understand which part of it is actually your story.
This is really important for us pantsers out there because we tend to start our story and then just wander around until we find the solution. So let's get into the example. Unlike our other episodes, we're not going to read an example because, well, I don't need to read a 400,000 word book to you to give you an example of too many words.
Yep.
We'll just say, if your problem is that there are too many words for your target genre, here are some things that you can look to find the solution.
The first thing that I will advise somebody to do if their story is too long is to cut out the first few chapters. Oftentimes, all of that scene setting, all of that backstory that you think the reader needs to know, the reader doesn't need to know. That's you as an author discovering the plot. Great, write it, cut it out of your final draft.
This is really difficult because it can feel like chopping off a limb. However, think of yourself as a reader. Are you going to stay interested long enough to keep reading? As a reader, does it keep you interested?
Starting later in the story is one of those first solutions you can easily cut down massive amounts of words in your word count.
Another thing that you can do is take out a subplot. You can cut a lot of words by getting rid of an unnecessary subplot.
It'll take you, the author, some time because you have to make sure you don't have continuity errors and all of that. We'll talk about that later this month. But your audience hopefully will never know that it's not there, and you get all this extra content for side characters' book later on. Take a close look at your prologues and your epilogues and make sure they belong in the story. This is a place that a lot of people can just toss this whole section out the window and we don't lose anything in the story.
I tend to like epilogues and prologues in fantasy because it gives me a look into the world. If your prologue has your main character, kill it.
Kill the main character?
Yes.
Yay!
Don't kill your main character. Just get rid of it. Because either it belongs in the actual story or it doesn't belong at all. Along with prologue and epilogue, get rid of backstory. if you are going on a backstory exposition in middle of your book, tease it in other conversations. You don't need a block of exposition.
If this information isn't already being conveyed, then it's not something that's necessary for the readers to know.
So another solution that you can do is just skip to a solution for a side character. This is more difficult with the main character. If you do it with the main character, it can feel like a deus ex machina. But with a side character, they can just have the gun instead of finding a gun.
Having the solution in there for a side character is totally okay. It's not that character's story, so we don't need to know all of these details.
Now on to our next problem. If you are not a fantasy author and you're not ridiculously verbose, sometimes you'll fall short of your target genre's general word count.
That's my problem, especially as an action author who enjoys writing fantasy. My writing style is still action author, so most of my fantasy novels are in the 65 to 75,000 word count.
Which is about 10,000, 15,000 words short of a short fantasy novel. So how do you fix it without just adding pointless pieces of story?
Yeah, we don't need to add more fluff. That's not the goal of any writing. Anybody who tells you that, smack them upside the head and just say it's from Lee S's on this podcast. She wants me to do this to you.
First thing that you should consider is maybe just make it a novella. Cut your word count down to novella length and publish it that way. That's fine. That's great. I love novellas.
But let's say it's the second book in the series and I need to add more somehow to match the first book.
Ask yourself if the solution was too easy. Were there enough try-fails in the process? Did they encounter enough problems along the way that delayed their progress to finding and reaching that solution?
When we talked about too much word count, a lot of the solution rested in the beginning and end of the book, taking out those first few chapters, taking out that epilogue. When it comes to adding words to your book, a lot of that solution ends up being in the middle of your book, adding those try-fails, fleshing out something that maybe was glazed over in your first draft of the story.
This is where I tend to struggle because how I write, I know how the story begins, I know how the story ends, and I fail in the middle. And it's because I don't have enough of these problems scattered along the way for them to encounter and fail at, or encounter and conquer. Talk about spreading too little butter over too much bread.
This, in my experience, often comes from a failure in my villain. If I have too few words, I haven't explored my villain enough. Making your villain interesting, making sure they're active in the middle part of your story, it's not just the beginning and the end, can help you flesh out that middle a lot more.
You can also take something that was assumed in the plot and make the character work for it instead. So instead of them already being trained in self-defense, that's something that they have to work for.
Adding those struggles helps make the whole fight of the story real.
And in some small cases, you can add another point of view character. This really only works if you're really far under the target word count.
And make sure that this point of view character disagrees with your main character in some way. You want to get a different view of the whole moment. Take the villain's point of view, take the secret ingredient character's point of view, take an interesting separate point of view, hoping that they're going to collide. The Witcher books are a great example of how to design a bunch of different stories that eventually collide.
Another thing that can help you add word count is focus on the world building, especially in fantasy or if there's something unique about the world. So look at the John Wick movies. There was a lot of action. That plot was driven by action. But they spent just enough time outside of the action to establish this world of underground assassins. that's the kind of thing that you can do. It is okay to take a break and focus on world building in an interesting way. Take a look at our boring episode that released just prior to this to make sure you do it right. But you can add words to a story and immerse your reader in the actual world that you've built. Both of these problems, having too many words, having too few words, comes down to one main thing. Know when the story starts and when the story finishes. Know your problem and solution.
And make sure as you're reading through it that you like what you're reading. You're entertained by what you're reading. Because if you are entertained, your audience is going to be entertained. Your bread to butter ratio should be about right if you're enjoying it. And that begins when you
write selfishly.
If you have a question or comment for our hosts or a topic you'd like us to cover, send us an email at writingroots@aspenhousepublishing.com or find us on Facebook by searching for Aspen House Publishing.